Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kathleen Canning, Dean of Humanities, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the third Kazimi Lecture. And I want to explain that this lecture is resulted from a wonderful gift of the children of Syed Safdar and Samini Kazmi in the honor of these parents. This endowment has allowed us to have three wonderful lectures, the first of which was December 2019 at the Museum of Fine Arts with curator Francesca Leoni. That was the inaugural lecture. And she's the assistant keeper and curator of Islamic art at the Ashmolean Museum of Art and Archaeology at the University of Oxford. The second lecture was, unfortunately due to COVID, held online, but was nonetheless a huge success, featuring Dr. Saeed Hussein Nasser, and I believe the audience extended to some 600 people. This new endowment of the Kazimi Lecture allows Rice University and the School of Humanities to bring world-class scholars across the spectrum of Shi'i Studies who will share their research with the Rice community, the broader Houston public, and with this dual format of both in-person and webinar, their research can be shared with the world. The location of the endowment in the School of Humanities lets us include speakers across the years from different disciplines who will explore Shi'i religious thought, culture, history, and art that remain relatively underrepresented and under-recognized in some scholarly arenas, despite the significance historically and in the modern world of Shi'i studies. We are extremely pleased that the Kazimi family and so many of their friends and colleagues could join us today, and we know that many of you are out there online. And we hope to hear from you during the question and answer period where you can use the Q&A to post your questions. I would like now to introduce you to Dr. Jeff Kripal, who's Associate Dean of Humanities and visionary of last year's and this year's Kazimi Lecture. Jeff is a renowned scholar of religion who has published, numerous 10, 12, rising to 15 books, and chaired the Rice Department of Religion for 8 years. His erudition, wisdom, and profoundly innovative scholarship have illuminated our office and the School of Humanities over the past 3 years. And Jeff Kripal will have the great honor of introducing our speaker today, Professor Alireza Doostdar from the University of Chicago. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Kazimi family. It's an honor. I'd like to introduce Professor Alireza Doostdar to you today. Dr. Doostdar is the Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and the Anthropology of Religion at the Divinity School and in the College of the University of Chicago. His primary focus is on Shi'i Islam, which he approaches as a dynamic tradition shaped in dialogue with other religious and secular formations, including and especially modern science and nation building. As a West Asia specialist, Dr. Doostdar has conducted most of his ethnographic and archival investigations in Iran, but he situates the phenomena he studies in relation to global circulations that take his research far beyond Iran's national borders. His first book, the Iranian Metaphysicals, Explorations in Science, Islam, and the Uncanny, examined the complex and multiplying intersections between science, seance, secularism, magical practice, and the Iranian state. Through archival and ethnographic research, he describes and analyzes various forms of esoteric practice and occult belief in contemporary Iran over the last century. He shows that far from being some tangential side interest or escape, such uncanny enthusiasms have long been at the heart of Orthodox Shi'i Islam and what it considers to be rational and Islamic, even as they have also challenged those same subjective formations. His next book is a study of the theology of Satan in Iran since the Islamic Revolution, which I know is the topic of his address tonight. Please help me welcome Professor Alireza Doostdar.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that introduction. Thank you to the Kazimi family for making this lecture possible. I'm also grateful to Andrew Steffel and John Waterhouse for making this a really, really smooth visit. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. I seek refuge with God from Satan the accursed. This is one of the most famous supplications in Islam, a prayer that Muslims intone whenever they begin to recite the Quran. The prayer also comes up in ordinary conversation in response to situations that incite fear, anxiety, dismay, or feelings of impropriety. Anytime a speaker is keen to ward off the threat of evil in her own speech, feelings, or actions, or evil she perceives in the speech and actions of others, we may hear her seek refuge in God from the accursed Satan. At first glance, the Islamic Satan appears to be a rather straightforward figure of evil. He is God's number one enemy, an arrogant rebel against divine command, the chief tempter and seducer of humankind. He oversees an army of smaller Satans, humans and jinn, who do his bidding. These Satans, both the big one and his minions, are destined to burn in hell along with everyone who follows them in transgression against God. When someone utters the supplication, I seek refuge with God from Satan the accursed, they may seem to confirm a binary opposition between God, the absolute good, and Satan, the absolute evil. And the supplicant takes a side. He asks God to protect him against every satanic harm. But things are not as straightforward as they appear. If we pay closer attention to all the ways Satan has been imagined, all the ways Muslims have thought not only against him, but with and through him, we realize that he is a far more complex, far more interesting figure than our initial impressions allow. My wager today is that we can begin to unravel this complexity through careful attention to the very supplication with which I began. I seek refuge with God from Satan the accursed. The multiple threads of meaning that have been woven together in this prayer can reveal to us something of Satan's multifaceted character in Islamic thought. Now, I'm trained as an anthropologist, and my regional focus is modern Iran. I approach Satan then through contemporary Iranian Shi'i thought and practice. But as I move through the presentation, I hope that what I have to say about modern Shi'i encounters with Satan will resonate for scholars of other Muslim communities in other times and places. And perhaps my approach will also help us gain some wider comparative understanding of Satan across religious traditions, and not only in Islam. A good deal of my talk will focus on two of the most prominent Shi'i thinkers of the 20th century, Ruhollah Khomeini, the jurist and mystic who founded the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Ali Shariati, the sociologist and public speaker, often dubbed an ideologue of the Islamic Revolution. After spending some time with these two thinkers, I will move on to a discussion of recent works in literature and music that engage with Satan and his demonic helpers as they reflect on social corruption and human suffering. Let's begin our analysis by zooming in on the first part of the supplication, A'udhu billah, I seek refuge with God. What is emphasized in this phrase is a relationship between God and a human supplicant. The human asks God for divine protection and support against harm from Satan. And just what kind of harm can Satan deliver to humankind? From the Quran, we learn that Satan is capable of various kinds of damage. He deceives, leads astray, makes one slip, instills fear, causes hatred and enmity, and may even cause disease and madness. Satan does these things through a variety of tactics. He makes false promises, injects delusional thoughts and feelings, whispers temptations, and most enigmatic of all, he touches people to make them ill or insane. The clearest Quranic evidence for Satan's power to cause disease comes in the story of the prophet Ayub or Job. We read in the Sad chapter of the Quran, وَاذْكُرْ عَبْدَنَا أَيُّوبَ إِذْ نَادَى رَبَّهُ أَنِّي مَسَّنِيَ الشَّيْطَانُ بِنُصْبٍ وَعَذَابٍ. And remember our servant Job, when he cried out to his Lord, "Indeed, Satan has touched me with hardship and torment." To this day, the concept of massa shaitan, the touch of Satan, is used in some Muslim societies to refer to demonic possession. In the pre-modern Shi'i tradition, Satan's dangers to humankind were elaborated in great detail. For example, in the 17th century, the eminent jurist and hadith scholar Muhammad Baqir Majlisi wrote a popular manual for pious conduct that he called Hilyatul Muttaqin, or the adornment of the God-fearing. The book, which remains in print to this day, draws on a vast reserve of traditions about the Prophet Muhammad and the imams from his household to recommend behaviors in the course of ordinary life, behaviors that exceed the simple observance of Islamic law. That's why it's an adornment, it's extra, it's going above and beyond simply the observance of the law. In a good deal of these recommendations, Majlisi describes satanic harms that may result from inappropriate behavior. So here are some examples. Whenever a man strips naked, Satan gazes at him and itches to cause him misfortune. Whoever walks with only one shoe on, with the other foot bare, Satan will gain control over him and drive him mad. This is in a section about proper dress. When people sit down to eat a meal and they neglect to recite in the name of God, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the angels tell Satan to sit down and eat with them. Eating a sweet pomegranate will drive away the whisperings of Satan, and it sort of gets better as you eat more pomegranates. If you recite God's name during sexual intercourse, Satan will be driven away, but if you don't, Satan participates in the intercourse, thus sharing in the formation of the offspring. Wash the grease and dirt from children's hands and face before bed, otherwise Satan will sniff their body and frighten them in their sleep. Do not grow your mustache long, nor the hairs of your armpits or your groins, because Satan will hide in it. Clip your nails. When they grow long, Satan hides underneath them and causes amnesia. Whoever urinates or defecates on a grave, or urinates while standing, or sleeps alone at home, or sleeps with hands smeared with food, Satan will seize him and drive him mad. And finally, do not leave your food containers uncovered, for Satan will spit in any uncovered vessel and take what he wants from it. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there's many, many more references in the Hilyatul Muttaqin to satanic dangers. So if Majlisi is to be trusted, when someone in the pre-modern period said, "I seek refuge with God," they could have been worrying about everything from night terrors to demons hiding in their mustache to going insane because they defecated on a grave. This wide array of satanic harms became more difficult to imagine in the modern period with the rise in discourses of public health, hygiene, and mental illness. So, for example, when I've asked Iranians about the hadith, which says if you grow your mustache long, Satan will hide in it, they usually say, well, that's just microbes. The reference to Satan is there as a reference to germs. And we actually don't know for sure what, even in the pre-modern period, people would have thought when they read this text, right? Could there be a certain kind of humorous intention? You know, I don't know, because we have to see how it was actually being read. But certainly it's given in a kind of a deadpan, very straightforward manner in the book itself. Conversely, I mean, even though people do say that, Satan doesn't actually hide in your beard, that doesn't mean that there is no longer a conception of satanic harm. So there's this expression in Persian, "Gush shaytun kar," may the devil go deaf, which is very similar to knock on wood in English. And people just say it in order to ward off evil whenever they say something about, like, they're hoping for something good to come out of an action. And so this expression, "Gush shaytun kar," gestures to an ambiguous sense of menace or misfortune that is then given the name of Satan. So while Satan's ability to inflict physical or psychological harm has not been completely eliminated, the scope for his nefarious operations has for the most part become restricted to deceptions and whisperings that lead people astray and nudge them toward moral transgressions. It's become mostly about psychology and about ethics. And here I can turn to my first major figure, Ruhollah Khomeini. So in the 1970s, as the Iranian revolutionary movement was gaining momentum, Ayatollah Khomeini articulated a complex three-dimensional image of Satan. He was at once an ethical diagnostic, a political foil, and a negative sign for mystical insight. In every instance, Satan was a power to be avoided and struggled against by seeking refuge with God. Let me explain these dimensions of Satan in turn. The ethical Satan was a staple of Khomeini's thought well before the revolution. In his commentary on 40 hadith, which he wrote in 1939 at the age of 37, Satan and his armies appear as stubborn enemies on the path of self-purification. Early in his book, Khomeini advises the spiritual struggler to devise a daily plan of vowing, examining, and accounting. That's musharete, muraqabeh, and muhasabeh. At the beginning of the day, they are to vow with themselves that they will not behave in ways that go against the word of God. Afterward, and for the duration of the day, they are to examine themselves to ensure that they abide by their vow. By night, they are to hold themselves to account, asking whether they have upheld or betrayed their vow. Satan and his armies may appear at the vowing or examining stages. In both cases, Khomeini advises his readers to curse Satan and his armies, cast false delusions out of their hearts, and proceed with determination. Essentially, this is supposed to be a regime of ethical self-making, right? Over a long period of time, as you work on yourself, you ask yourself every single day to pay attention to every single thing that you're doing and keep yourself to account. As you do that over a long period of time, then you purify your morals. This notion of Satan as ethical obstacle remained central to Khomeini's thought throughout his career. In a speech to seminary students in 1965, for example, he said that the accursed Satan wanted to deceive mankind and lead him to unbelief, a challenge that should be confronted with relentless self-examination and vigilant struggle against vice. This is a quote from this speech. Whenever one takes a step in the direction of acquiring knowledge, one must, at the same time, take at least one step, if not two steps, in the purification of morals, in solidifying convictions, in establishing faith in the heart. He was trying to emphasize that it's not, knowledge by itself is never enough. It has to be accompanied with ethical purification. This requires thinking, it requires calculation, it requires self-examination. The gentlemen, meaning the people he was addressing, need to examine themselves. They need to care for themselves from dawn to dusk. The human soul, or nafs, is unruly. If we neglect it for one moment, we seek refuge with God. It, the soul, will drag a man to unbelief, kufr, not only to iniquity or fisq. Notice here that we seek refuge with God. There's already a suggestion that Satan is somehow involved with when one thinks about the nafs, the soul. And then he continues, Satan is not satisfied with our iniquity. He wants our unbelief. He wants to lead everyone to unbelief. But he begins with small sins and little by little leads one to bigger sins until it gets to a point where, God forbid it, he leads man entirely away from Islam. We see in this passage that Khomeini established a connection, if not an equivalence, between Satan and an aspect of the human soul that was responsible for selfish, sinful behavior. This so-called soul that commands to evil, nafs ammare, according to Khomeini, was a kind of internal Satan, a Satan that we carry around with us at all times. External Satans, meanwhile, whisper and insinuate in ways that reinforce the internal deviator. As the revolutionary movement gathered momentum over a decade later, Khomeini's articulation of Satan took on an increasingly political valence. This is the second dimension of Satan in Khomeini's thought. By the summer of 1978, he had inserted a plurality of Satans into political discourse. These were humans with a satanic nature who were bent on deceiving and seducing the strugglers on God's path, to lead them toward vice, discord, and finally defeat. He included the Shah in this plurality, declaring, for example, that his stated attempt at national reconciliation was nothing but a satanic ruse, neirang shaitani. Soon thereafter, he included the American military in the satanic collective. Then in November of the same year, 2 months after the Black Friday massacre, he turned his attention directly to US President Jimmy Carter. This was still during the Shah's rule, ridiculing his apparent concern for human rights in Iran as the teaching of Satan. This demonization of powerful politicians prefigured Khomeini's use of the term Great Satan soon after the revolution, with which I'm sure all of you are familiar. He appears to have uttered the phrase in public for the first time in May 1979, but in the plural. The great Satans he had in mind seemed to include the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, world powers that were pulling the strings of lesser local Satans who pushed for alternatives to an Islamic republic. Over time, Khomeini reduced the plurality of great Satans to a singular great Satan, his well-known epithet for the United States. But even then, he continued to maintain an alternative sense for the great Satan as the first being who rebelled against God. For example, he would utter prayers protecting everyone from the evil of the great Satan and those who follow him, as well as from the evil of the soul that commands to evil. This was a juxtaposition that was well in line with the ethical conception of Satan and did not have to be reduced to condemnation of the United States. You see here some of the iconography that was also developing in this time about Satan, right? So specifically, the satanic hand being that of the veto powers. And it's on United Nations Day. It was a stamp issued to commemorate the Day of the United Nations in 1983. Okay. While expanding his political demonology, Khomeini held on to a mystical conception of Satan as an evil disposition that distorted the human soul. And this is the third aspect of Satan for Khomeini. It's a mystical one. About 1 month before the revolution's victory, while still in exile in France, Khomeini responded to the Shah's complaint that the people did not truly understand or appreciate him. The Shah was essentially saying, all these protests that are happening, people trying to topple me, it's because they don't really understand what I've done, all the great things I've done for this nation. Khomeini acknowledged that this was correct in a way that could only be grasped through mystical theology. He said, yeah, that's right, people don't really understand you, and to grasp what that means, though, we need to turn to mystical theology. That is, humans' true nature could never be revealed in the material world. Once the veil of materiality was lifted with death, he said, it would be possible to see individual humans in the form of animals or Satans, depending on their sedimented, enduring dispositions. So this is what he said. You will see a human with 10 enduring dispositions appear in 10 forms. He is one, but his dispositions are aligned. His lustful animality is so dominant that he appears in the form of a lustful animal like the pig. The form of his viciousness is also very dominant, the way that exists in animals, like the panther, for example. And the mischief, deceptions, and ruses are great. Here, when the page turns, he is fully Satan. And at the same time that he has a satanic form, he also has a vicious form, the highest stage of viciousness. And he also has a lustful animal form, the highest stage of lust. He appears in these different forms. The most remarkable point in this passage is that Khomeini thought there was an actual satanic form that could be perceived after death, in much the same way as one might perceive the appearance of an animal. Given his training in mystical philosophy, he probably believed that humans gifted with divine extrasensory perception could sometimes see these forms in their waking lives in this world. In addition, this passage makes it clear that a human Satan is not merely one who follows the greater Satan in transgression against God. Sins also transmogrify and distort the human's form to make him or her resemble a Satan in the immaterial realm. Khomeini actually didn't say what Satan looks like, but the idea was that there is some kind of form that people take on over time as you increasingly do bad things. Now, Khomeini did not make a hard distinction between the Satans of political intrigue and the Satans of inner deviance. The two were clearly connected. In remarks to the cabinet in 1980, for example, he famously declared that whoever says I, this I is Satan. In another speech to government officials in 1983, he argued that political infighting emerged from a flaw that humanity had inherited from Satan, a kind of primordial propensity towards sin. So this is what he said. We have to struggle to fortify this spirituality and to suppress the selfhood as much as we can. If this is solved, everything will be solved. Discords are built on the same issue. There's no discord in the world that does not have this as its basis. From the first day, Satan said, "You created me out of fire, whereas you created him out of clay." I'll get to what this means later. "I am better than him," said Satan. He refused God and told God that I am better. This satanic inheritance is an inheritance for all of us. Now, I'll talk about Satan's primordial act of rebellion against God in a moment. For now, I want to point out that the final sentence here, where human selfhood or perhaps selffulness is identified as a satanic inheritance, is extraordinary because it suggests that humans' propensity towards sin is directly connected to Satan's primordial act of arrogance. If humans inherited selffulness from Satan, then Satan is, in his original act of selffulness, the father of all humanity. This makes Satan a much more intimate figure than the image of the accursed seducer typically makes him out to be. Khomeini seemed to be suggesting that humans are seducible precisely because they all have something of Satan in them. This notion of Satan as an intimate ancestor or aspect of the human soul draws our focus to a dimension of his being that is quite different from a mere enemy to be resisted and avoided. So let's turn to our supplication. I seek refuge with God from Satan the accursed. This time, focusing on the backstory of what made Satan an accursed being in the eyes of God. So I want to emphasize the Satan the accursed part of the supplication. There's a narrative in the Quran about a being named Iblis that is usually understood as the origin story of Satan. In Western scholarship on Islam, Iblis is typically thought to have its etymological source in the Greek diabolos, which is also where we get the English devil. The Iblis narrative is repeated several times in the Quran, each slightly different from the others. One of the fullest accounts appears in Surah A'raf, the Heights. These are the verses. And we have certainly created you and given you form. This is addressed to humanity. Then we said to the angels, prostrate to Adam. So they prostrated, except for Iblis. He was not of those who prostrated. God said, what prevented you from prostrating when I commanded you? Iblis said, I am better than him. You created me from fire and created him from clay. This is what Khomeini was referring to a few moments earlier. God said, descend, for it is not for you to be arrogant therein. So get out, indeed you are of the debased. Iblis said, reprieve me until the day they are resurrected. God said, indeed you are of those reprieved. Iblis said, because you have put me in error, I will surely sit and wait for them on your straight path. Then I will come to them from before them and from behind them, and on their right and on their left, and you will not find most of them grateful. God said, get out, reproached and expelled. Whoever follows you among them, I will surely fill hell with you all together. Iblis was cursed then because he refused to go along with the other angels and bow to Adam when God commanded him to do so. There are a lot of graphic representations of this in Persian and Indian art in particular. So this is one example from the 17th century, which went on auction, unfortunately, a few years ago in the UK. But you see the angels prostrating to Adam in the middle, and then Iblis is sitting there not prostrating, and it seems like he's sitting on a prayer mat. And notice his figure. He does not look like a devil as we would imagine him. So usually this is identified as the moment in which Iblis becomes Shaitan, Satan. But why did he refuse to prostrate? In the verses we are told that Iblis thought himself better than Adam, for he was created from fire and Adam was created from clay. God responded by accusing Iblis of arrogance and expelling him from his presence. For most Muslim thinkers, it is this accusation of arrogance that has stuck as the key identifying mark, the quintessential vice that defines Iblis or Satan. Khomeini, as we saw, agreed with this view, and he believed that the human propensity toward arrogance and self-aggrandizement was an inheritance from Satan. But not every Muslim thinker accepted this view. Less than 3 centuries after the rise of Islam, a minority Sufi opinion developed arguing that Iblis's refusal to prostrate himself before Adam came not from pride, but from passionate love for God. So intense was Iblis's devotion to his Lord that he could not bring himself to bow before anyone but him. Iblis then was a perfect, if tragic, monotheist, one who was willing to endure damnation but would not give up his love of God. Over the centuries, this Sufi attempt to redeem Iblis was elaborated and gained further traction. And there's some wonderful scholarship on this that I'm not going to get into too much of the details, but if you're interested, there's a classic book by Peter Owen called Satan's Tragedy and Redemption. And more recently, there's a really wonderful dissertation by Abul Fazl Mushiri that looks at this Sufi attempt to redeem Satan. In the 20th century, the Shi'i thinker who came closest to this Sufi view was the revolutionary sociologist and public speaker Ali Shariati. Like the Sufis, Shariati's perspective on Satan drew fundamentally on Iblis's backstory, his refusal to prostrate himself before Adam. But his reading was also indebted to the Indian subcontinent philosopher Muhammad Iqbal as well as the European thinkers, as well as modern European thinkers from, European thinkers from Milton, was not modern, to Nietzsche, Sartre, and Heidegger. Drawing on this eclectic set of inspirations, Shariati imagined Satan as a tragic, contradictory figure whose travails could be harnessed to a humanistic reading of Adam's fall and his subsequent reunion with God. Through both overt comparison and subtle allusions and turns of phrase, Shariati suggested that there were important affinities between human courage and freedom, on the one hand, and Satan's refusal of the divine command. Now, the bulk of Shariati's reflections on Satan appears in an essay called Hobut, The Descent, which he wrote in 1969. It is among his self-described desert writings, or kaviriyat, reflections of a mystical or even ecstatic character written in passionate prose and laden with complex, sometimes cryptic and contradictory symbolism. Hobut is a first-person account of the creation of primordial man, his fall, and his subsequent struggle to reunite with God. So he kind of takes out, he draws on the story of Adam, but he doesn't call him Adam, he just calls him primordial man, or deals with him as primordial man and writes from a first-person perspective, as if it's Adam who's talking. Or it could be Shariati who's talking. The essay has been read as a spiritual autobiography written in code, as well as a philosophical meditation on human self-consciousness and freedom. What I'd like to focus on here is how Shariati figures Satan as an ally of humanity. Early in the essay, the primordial man, who narrates the story, offers a moving account of the pre-eternal covenant, in which God asks all of creation whether he is not their Lord. Every created being answers in unison, yes, indeed. Then God begins to write down the fate of every speck, casting his warm and loving glance upon them in turn. This is a point in which, according to there's a verse in the Quran which refers to the primordial covenant or the pre-eternal covenant, but it's all of creation are brought before God, and he asks them, am I not your Lord? Often in the telling of this story, it's not that they're fully formed beings, but they're rendered as little specks. So this is the way that Shariati articulates this. They're little tiny specks that appear before God. So when God faces the primordial man, his gaze turns brighter, warmer, more loving. And then Shariati says this: his face was the face of a kindly father who conceals his laughter and secretly revels in the deviltry of his rebellious but lovable child. The word that I've translated here as deviltry is shaitanat, which is derived from shaitan and means mischief, often referring to a playfulness of a childish or coquettish sort. Shariati ties mischief and deviltry to human rebellion, which is significant that given only a few paragraphs later, he narrates Satan's defiant refusal to prostrate before mankind. In God's eyes, man is rebellious like Satan and yet lovable. We see a hint of what Shariati means by this in his account of how God offers all of creation his trust, or amana, symbolized in the form of a great fire. In the well-known Quranic story that Shariati elaborates, the human is the only one who undertakes to bear the trust. But this is a wild, fiery entity that every other creature had recognized as terrifying and unbearable. Mankind is foolish and wicked to have accepted it. And yet, by accepting it, man takes up something divine with which he attains his full potential and through which he rules the earth. Shariati argues that the trust granted to mankind is a divine power to self-create and to create the world. As he writes in another essay, by virtue of taking on the divine trust, man becomes a demigod, a lonely, exiled theomorph. The Persian words he uses are shibh khoda and khodaguneh. There is more to this account than what has been conventionally espoused in Islamic theology. Shariati's description of the trust as a fire alludes directly to the myth of Prometheus. Elsewhere, he compares Satan's transgression in offering the fruit of knowledge to Adam and Eve with Prometheus's offering of the stolen fire to humanity. This was a parallel with which he was likely familiar from his reading of Nietzsche and the European Romantics. Shariati next turns to Satan's persona as mankind's jealous enemy. In Hobut, he writes that Satan disobeyed God's command to bow before the primordial man, not out of arrogance, but because he was passionately in love with God. Satan's was a jealous love that destroys love itself, and God rewards his love by leaving him to exact his revenge on man. As mankind's enemy, Satan now becomes the negative condition for his striving. It is Satan who creates and strengthens the need for God in our souls. The heart is cultivated in fighting him, Shariati says, just as we come to recognize freedom in his terrifying prison. But Shariati's ideal striving is more humanist than God-fearing. In narrating his tale of fall and ascent, the primordial man describes how he grows conscious of and overcomes his four creators: nature, history, society, and the self. He overcomes these constraints only to create them anew, becoming godlike, the lone creator of his self and his world. He is a rebellious negation, or his is a rebellious negation, clearly inspired by Satan's original refusal of the divine command. Thus, mankind, says Shariati, is a tree of rebellion, a flower of negation. I'll give you an extended passage where he gets into this because I think it's really interesting. Responding to the entirety of the universe, he, meaning man, is no from head to toe. His being is the non-being of everything except him. He proves his existence through the gradual negation of his own nature. Humans are all artists, each to the degree of the art they possess and to the extent that they deny the reality of nature to innovate their truth. This is the spirit that God breathed of himself into mankind. It is what God taught him, what made him worthy of the prostration of all the angels, as well as his original sin. It is his exile to earth and his kinship with God and his complicity with Satan, and the source of his suffering. If God calls him wicked and foolish, this is where it comes from. And if he looks him over in delight and says, "Hallowed is God, the best of creators," this is why. Shariati owed the broad outlines of his description of Satan as an archetype of rebellious self-creation to the Indian subcontinent philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, whom he deeply admired. Like Shariati, Iqbal saw the repulsion or the expulsion of Adam and Eve from heaven as a first step towards their self-consciousness. In a poetic account of Satan's refusal of the command to prostrate before Adam, Iqbal had Satan declare to God that you impart life to the body while I grant rebellion to life. You rob the calm, I guide with ardor. According to Iqbal, Satan's daring spirit breathed ambition into the dust of man, the warp and woof of his mind and reason having been woven of Satan's sedition. Elsewhere, Satan affirms his faith in God and claims that he accepted God's wrath to allow man to reach volition from fatality. In another poem, Iqbal's Satan laments that most humans are too obedient to him, in an ironic turning of the tables that surely resonated with Shariati. He regrets that his weak and effeminate followers, they're being unlit by what he calls ego's spark, and they never feel the thrill of disobedience. It is this satanic spark that, in Iqbal's language, makes of man a creative self-maker, a self-demolisher, and a self-regulator. Now, Shariati's paradoxical Satan was a world apart from Khomeini's tripartite image of the accursed one, as an ethical, mystical, and political exemplar of evil. Khomeini's vision left no space for a morally ambiguous account of Satan that kept redemption open as a possibility, much less one that celebrated his defiance before God. For Shariati, by contrast, Satan's Promethean revolt was a model to emulate as the prototypical act of negation, even if he also blamed human wickedness on his satanic inheritance and agreed that Satan's jealousy caused his downfall. If Khomeini principally thought against Satan, we could say that Shariati wanted to think with him. Khomeini's vision of Satan as I was conducive to his construction of a revolutionary polity, because God's state would rise higher as his followers negated themselves in the divine and subordinated themselves to his state. Shariati's satanic I, on the other hand, could certainly have been a powerful energizer of revolutionary self-assertion and self-determination, but had he lived to see the republic that rose from the revolutionary ferment, it's doubtful he would have been content to see people surrender their rebellious creativity to a new political apparatus. Over the past decade, new ways of apprehending Satan have appeared in popular culture that express neither a will to approach God through battling the whisperings of evil, nor a desire to self-create on the model of Iblis's rebellion against divine tyranny. If Khomeini had insisted on thinking against Satan and Shariati had preferred to think with him, we can detect in these popular narratives an attempt to think through Satan. Before I show you some examples, I want to return one last time to our supplication. I seek refuge with God from Satan the accursed. I emphasize the first part of the prayer, when I spoke to you about Majlisi and Khomeini's antagonism against Satan, in exploring the views of medieval Sufis and modern figures like Shariati and Iqbal who prefer to think with Satan, I looked to the backstory of Iblis, what led to his being cursed and expelled from the realm of divine intimacy. Now, in turning to some ways of thinking through Satan, I want to focus specifically on his accursedness. For some contemporary Iranians, the figure of Satan can help us explore themes of human suffering, helplessness, moral confusion, and corruption. It is as if these Iranians are asking, what if we, like Satan, have been cursed? What if God has forsaken us just as he abandoned Iblis? My first example is a satirical diary published 2 years ago by Ibrahim Raha. Titled 1 Month with Satan, Yek Mah ba Shaitan, the book follows the accursed one for 30 days as he attempts to deceive humans and seduce them into the ways of sin. One day he tries to get some kids to cheat on their exam. Another day he tries to convince someone to rob a car. The next day he tries to start a war on social media. The following day he tries to trick cosmetic surgeons into using fake prostheses on their patients, and so on and so forth. He fails every single attempt. The humans, Satan finds, have beat him at doing every horrible thing imaginable. They've already mastered the arts of lying, duplicity, trickery, backbiting, indecency, and arrogance with no need for any help from Satan. As the Persian expression goes, they could teach Satan himself. Frustrated and desperate, Satan worries that he will soon be out of a job, that his existence has become pointless, and for the first time since the creation of Adam, he will be forced to join the ranks of the unemployed. Raha's book is a satire about moral decline in contemporary Iranian society, even though he does gesture a couple times to people in places beyond Iran, especially Trump and Superman. But there's a way to read Satan's diary also as a perverse commentary on the inability of sincere individuals to succeed, precisely because duplicity and corruption have permeated every social space imaginable. Satan here stands ironically for someone just trying to do his job, his cosmic profession, as it were, yet failing because of society's moral downfall. He is then doubly abject, doubly cursed, doubly forsaken. It is telling that God appears nowhere in the text except when humans are insincerely invoking his name as part of their schemes to one-up and defraud each other. It's as though Satan has become just another Iranian, a hapless member of a society abandoned by God because they abandoned him. Dejected, with nowhere to turn, he is frustrated that his talents cannot flourish because others are prepared to go further even than him in embracing monstrous behavior. Let me conclude by emphasizing the diversity with which Shi'i Muslims have thought about Satan in the 20th and 21st centuries. As in the Islamic tradition more broadly, the Shi'i conception of Satan is neither unitary nor simple. Rather than trying to locate the Shi'i perspective, then, I've opted to zoom in on particular figures and ask how Satan has allowed them to approach broader problems of ethical striving, freedom, suffering, and one's relationship to God. There's a poem by the 13th century poet, prose writer, and moralist Sa'di of Shiraz that describes a dream in which a man encounters Iblis. This man is astonished to find that Iblis is strikingly beautiful, a beautiful, radiant figure, more angel than demon. So he asks him, if you have such a beautiful figure, then why are you known as the epitome of ugliness and corruption? Iblis cries out in pain. He says, what you describe is not my true form at all. But my problem is that the paintbrush is in the hands of my enemies. It is they who have depicted me as ugly. One lesson we can take away from Sa'di's story is that to understand Satan, we need to pay attention to who is holding the paintbrush. Each image of Satan also gives us a glimpse into how God is imagined and approached. Is God an omnipotent being that one strives toward by subduing an evil disposition within one's soul? Or is God a loving creator who delights in human mischief and encourages us to become free, self-creating beings in our own right? Or finally, has God washed his hands from the scene of human suffering altogether, forsaking his creation and leaving them to their own devices? Satan is not a negative image that we can simply invert to understand God, but neither can we understand God from an Islamic perspective without trying to grasp his design for Satan and why it is that he is so intimately bound up Satan's fate with that of humanity. Thank you.